Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into a really fascinating and maybe for many quite a surprising idea.
Yeah, the idea that violence has actually declined throughout human history.
It's a massive claim, isn't it? Especially, with the news cycle we all live in.
It absolutely feels counterintuitive sometimes. And this deep dive, well, it's all about unpacking that idea. We're looking specifically at a hugely influential and also pretty controversial book from 2011.
Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined.
That's the one. And our guide for this exploration is a really detailed Wikipedia entry. It pulls together his core arguments, the evidence he uses, and importantly, the really strong reactions, both the praise and the criticism.
Right. So our mission here is basically to give you a clear, concise shortcut to understanding this whole complex subject.
Exactly. We're going to distill the most important insights from this source material, what Pinker argues, why he argues it, and, well, why it kicked up such a fuss.
Okay, let's unpack that central thesis then, as laid out in our source. What's the big takeaway?
The core message is, well, very direct. Violence in the world has declined, period.
And not just recently.
No. He argues this decline is huge, enormous even, and you can see it over millennia, but also over shorter timescales.
And across the board, it seems. The source mentioned a lot of different areas.
Yeah, pretty much everything. Military conflict, homicide rates, genocide, torture, criminal justice, even how societies treat children, minorities, animals, homosexuals. He sees this broad, long-term downward trend.
But it's not like a smooth, straight line down, is it? The source seemed careful to note that Pinker adds some nuance.
Oh, absolutely crucial. He stresses, the decline hasn't been perfectly smooth, violence obviously hasn't disappeared, and there's no guarantee it will keep going down.
So it's a historical trend, not some kind of achieved utopia.
Precisely. And the book's title, Better Angels of Our Nature, that's a metaphor, right? He takes it from Abraham Lincoln.
Right. The source explains these better angels. They represent 4 specific human motivations. Empathy, self-control, what he calls the moral sense, and reason. Pinker basically writes that these are the parts of our nature that can, steer us away from violence towards cooperation and altruism.
Okay. And when it comes to the causes of this decline, what does Pinker think it isn't? The source mentioned he rejects some common ideas.
Yeah, he's pretty clear, according to the source. He doesn't think it's down to major changes in human biology or, basic cognitive abilities. He also kind of steps away from a simple nature versus nurture debate.
So if humans haven't fundamentally changed on the inside, what has changed to make us, well, less violent?
His argument is that the key changes are external, in our cultural and material milieu, as the source puts it. Meaning the social structures, institutions, technology, our ways of life, all that stuff around us has evolved. And he thinks these external shifts have given our more peaceable motives, those better angels, the upper hand, over our more violent side. That's a powerful idea. That peace isn't mainly about changing human nature itself, but about changing the world we live in to favor our better side.
Exactly. And the Wikipedia source, it gives us a pretty handy roadmap of how the book itself is structured to build this case.
Right. It starts by laying out the evidence, doesn't it? Several chapters showing these historical trends of declining violence.
Yeah, demonstrating the what. Then it dives into the why from the inside, exploring the psychological stuff, the internal drives leading to violence. He calls these the 5 inner demons.
And balancing that out, there's a section on the flip side, the motivations away from violence.
The 4 better angels, exactly.
And finally, he connects it all up, looking at the big historical forces.
Yep, the 5 historical forces that Pinker argues are responsible for kind of empowering those better angels and driving this long-term decline.
That structure makes sense. So let's get into the evidence first. What are these 6 big trends of declining violence that the source highlights from Pinker's book?
Okay, the first one goes way, way back. The pacification process. This is about that huge shift, maybe 5,000 years ago, from hunter-gatherer life, early horticulture, to the first big agricultural civilization.
And the impact was?
A massive reduction in chronic raiding, feuding, that sort of thing. The source mentioned something like a 5-fold decrease in the rate of violent death compared to those earlier societies. Settled life, early states, seemed to calm things down.
Okay. Then jumping forward, focusing on Europe, there's the civilizing process.
Right. Pinker borrows that term from the sociologist Norbert Elias. It describes this incredible drop in European homicide rates, like 10 to 50 times lower between the late Middle Ages and the 20th century.
And the source links that to states getting stronger, centralizing power.
Yeah. basically.
Yeah.
Moving from fragmented feudal territories to larger kingdoms, then nation-states, you get more centralized authority, courts, police, and also the infrastructure for commerce starts developing.
Okay. Next up, a bit shorter timescale, the humanitarian revolution.
This one really gets going around the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, 17th, 18th centuries. Pinker credits the historian Lynn Hunt with the concept, I think.
And this is where we see the first big organized movements against specific kinds of cruelty.
Exactly. The source points to the first campaigns against slavery, dueling, judicial torture, killing people for superstition, really sadistic punishments, even cruelty to animals. It's like the beginning of a conscious effort to reduce suffering, and maybe the first stirrings of pacifism as a real movement.
Then, much closer to our own time, the Long Peace.
Yeah, attributed to historian John Lewis Gaddis. This refers to the period after World War II. And the really striking thing here is that the major world powers, the big developed states, have largely stopped fighting wars directly against each other.
Which was pretty much unprecedented before then, right?
Totally unprecedented on that scale for that long.
And then, even more recently, there's the New Peace.
This one's described as maybe a bit more tentative, a trend since the Cold War ended around 1989. It points to a decline in organized conflicts worldwide. So, civil wars, genocides, repression by autocrats, even, according to some data in the source, terrorist attacks compared to earlier peaks.
Interesting. And the last one, the rights revolutions.
This also covers the post-war era. It reflects this growing social intolerance, a kind of revulsion, really, against smaller-scale aggression. Violence directed at vulnerable groups, specifically.
Like ethnic minorities, women, children, LGBTQ plus people, animals.
Exactly. The source notes these movements, civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, animal rights, they kind of spun off from the broader idea of human rights, really taking off from the late 1950s onwards.
Okay, so Pinker weaves these 6 trends together, spanning millennia down to recent decades, to make this case that, despite bumps and horrors along the way, the overall historical arc is bending away from violence.
That's the core empirical claim, yeah.
Now, to understand why this might be happening, he looks at our psychology. What are these 5 inner demons that the source says Pinker identifies as driving violence?
Well, first off, the source says Pinker pushes back against that old idea of a single pent-up aggression drive, like a pressure cooker that needs to blow.
The hydraulic theory.
Right. Instead, he sees violence coming from several distinct psychological systems, like different internal triggers.
Okay, what's the first one?
Predatory or practical violence. This is basically violence used instrumentally as a cold-blooded means to an end, like raiding a village to steal food or resources.
Violence as a tool. Makes sense. Second.
Dominance. This is that drive for status, prestige, authority, power. Pinker sees this behind a lot of conflict, from playground bullies to empires clashing, individuals and groups jockeying for position.
Right. Third demon.
Revenge. This is that powerful, often moralistic urge for retribution, an eye for an eye. It fuels those cycles of retaliation and feuding.
Like even for
Sadism. The source describes this as, well, the deliberate infliction of pain, just for the pleasure derived from seeing someone suffer. It's darker, maybe less common, but definitely a factor.
And the 5th inner demon.
Ideology. This is a big one. It's when a shared belief system, often a grand vision of utopia, or maybe religious or political purity, justifies, even demands, unlimited violence to achieve its goals. The ends justify the means, however brutal.
Okay, so those are the psychological currents Pinker says push us towards violence. But then he contrasts them with the better angels pulling us away. What are those for?
First up is empathy. Pretty straightforward, our ability to feel what others are feeling, especially their pain. It makes it harder to hurt them if you can sense their suffering.
Feeling someone else's pain. Second angel.
Self-control. Our capacity to think ahead, anticipate the consequences of our actions, and inhibit those immediate impulsive urges, including violent ones.
Resisting the impulse. Third is the moral sense.
Yeah, this is about our ability to create and internalize shared rules, norms, taboos about how we should treat each other within our group.
Now, the source flagged an important point here. This moral sense isn't always a force for less violence overall, is it?
That's a really crucial distinction Pinker makes, according to the source. A strong moral code might absolutely stop you hurting people inside your group, your tribe, your nation, your religion. But that same code can sometimes be used to justify horrific violence against outsiders or heretics or people who break the rules, especially if the morality is very tribal or authoritarian or puritanical.
So it's a double-edged sword. It can bind a group together peacefully inside, but maybe increase conflict with those outside.
Exactly. It depends on what the moral code is and who it applies to.
Okay. And the final better angel.
Reason. Pinker sees this as our ability to step back from our immediate gut feelings and parochial viewpoints, to use logic, to recognize the self-defeating cycles of violence, to weigh costs and benefits, and to frame violence not as inevitable, but as a problem to be solved.
The source mentioned Peter Singer's phrase, the escalator of reason.
Yeah, Pinker credits Singer with that metaphor. The idea is that applying reason more consistently helps us sort of rise above our narrow self-interest and tribal biases, leading to more rational and ultimately more peaceable choices over the long haul. He looks at biological evolution, but feels it doesn't quite explain the speed and scale of the decline he sees. He thinks these other factors, especially reason becoming more dominant, are key.
All right, so if these better angels, empathy, self-control, moral sense, reason, are part of our nature, why have they seemingly gained ground over the inner demons? This brings us to those 5 historical forces the source outlines. What are they?
Pinker argues these large-scale historical shifts have basically changed the environment in ways that favor the better angels and suppress the inner demons. Force number 1 is the Leviathan.
Thomas Hobbes' idea. The rise of the modern nation-state with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you have a state with courts and police that can credibly punish violence and enforce contracts, individuals and groups have less incentive to, attack preemptively or take justice into their own hands through revenge. It sort of outsources self-control.
It makes personal vendettas and constant low-level warfare less rational, or at least riskier. Okay, second force.
Commerce. Basically the growth of trade, markets, and economic interdependence.
The idea that people become more valuable alive than dead, positive-sum games?
Precisely. If someone is more valuable to you as a trading partner or customer than as a corpse you can loot, you're less likely to attack them. Plus, trade encourages seeing things from others' perspectives, fostering a kind of practical empathy.
Makes sense. Third historical force, feminization.
The source describes this as society showing increasing respect for the interests and values typically associated more with women, things like valuing life over risky honor, negotiation over confrontation. As women's influence grows, societies may become less tolerant of violence.
Interesting. And the fourth force, cosmopolitanism.
This is driven by things like rising literacy, increased travel, mass media, the internet. All the things that expose us to people, cultures, and ideas beyond our own little bubble.
Expanding our horizons.
Yeah. It prompts us to take other people's perspectives, broadens our circle of empathy, makes strangers seem less strange and threatening. It feeds both empathy and reason.
Seeing the bigger picture. And the fifth force is the escalator of reason.
Right. This ties back to the better angel of reason. It's about the intensifying application of knowledge, science, and rationality to human affairs over time. As we understand the world better, including the causes and consequences of violence, we get better at designing systems and norms to prevent it. We recognize its futility.
So Pinker's grand narrative, as presented in the source, is that these 5 forces, the state, trade, women's rising influence, global interconnectedness, and applied reason, have collectively tilted the playing field, giving our peaceful inclinations a better chance to win out over our violent ones.
That's the essence of it. And the source mentions he builds on ideas from thinkers like Hobbes, Norbert Elias, John Mueller, and Joshua Goldstein. Pinker and Goldstein even wrote an op-ed together, didn't they? War really is going out of style.
Right. Okay, that lays out the core argument, the evidence, the proposed causes. Now, the reaction. A book making such a huge counterintuitive claim was bound to stir things up, right? Let's start with the positive reception.
Oh yeah, the source shows it got a lot of praise from some very big names. Review aggregators gave it high marks, and reviewers often highlighted the sheer volume of data, the clear writing, even Pinker's occasional humor.
Bill Gates was a massive fan, wasn't he? Called it one of the most important books he'd ever read.
He did. Selected it for Desert Island Discs, recommended it as a graduation present, apparently causing it to re-enter bestseller lists. He praised its contribution to scholarship and, well, to the world.
Philosopher Peter Singer, whose escalator of reason metaphor Pinker used, called it supremely important, a masterly achievement. Found the case convincing.
Political scientist Robert Jervis said the case was hard to refute. The trends weren't subtle. The explanations were serious.
Michael Shermer, the psychologist, emphasized how Pinker's data really challenged common perceptions shaped by media, calling it a page-turner. David Runciman over at Cambridge said, "Everyone should read this astonishing book."
Yeah, Tim Radford, a science journalist, called it an epic history by an optimist. Persuasive.
Yeah.
Lots of reviewers basically said, look, even if you don't buy every single point, you have to engage with the arguments and the data he presents.
It was described as mind-changing, a marvelous synthesis.
Definitely. Though the source does note that even within positive reviews, sometimes specific points were contested. It mentions James Q. Wilson, for instance.
That's political scientist?
Yeah, he called it a masterly effort overall. But the source says Wilson specifically objected to some of Pinker's characterizations of recent political figures, or events like his comments on George W. Bush, or John Kerry, or certain groups.
Right, and it's crucial we frame those as Wilson's specific objections to Pinker's assertions, not facts we're endorsing here.
Exactly. The source is clear on that. But the overall initial wave of reception, as described in the source, was definitely strongly positive. People praised the evidence-based approach against what they saw as just pessimism based on headlines. Neil Boyd, a criminologist mentioned in the source, strongly defended the book against critics later on.
Okay, but such a bold thesis inevitably drew fire. And it seems the criticisms were just as strong and came from many different directions. We need to be really careful here to present these impartially, just outlining the arguments against Pinker's book as reported in our source.
Absolutely. Let's stick to what the source says the critics argued. One major line of attack, maybe the most prominent early on, focused on Pinker's data analysis and statistical methods, especially regarding war.
Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the statistician and essayist, comes up first in the source.
Right. He argued very forcefully that the long peace after WWII might just be a statistical illusion. He said Pinker didn't properly account for the possibility of extremely rare but massive black swan events, like another world war. He accused Pinker of confusing rigorous statistics with anecdotes, making claims that data couldn't really support.
And Pinker replied?
Pinker, according to the source, countered that his stats were descriptive of the past, not predictive guarantees for the future, and that the book explicitly says major shocks can still happen.
Yeah.
But the debate didn't stop there. Taleb and a colleague later published work using different statistical models' power laws, arguing there was no statistically significant decline in the lethality of wars.
And other researchers crunched the numbers too.
Yeah, Aaron Closet, a computer scientist, looked at war data and concluded that Pinker's trends, including the long peace, could plausibly be the result of chance variation, given the time frame. He suggested we'd need maybe another 100 and 140 years of peace to be statistically confident it wasn't just luck. Others used different statistical distributions and found maybe a decrease after 1950, but not necessarily before.
So a real technical debate about the statistics themselves. How do you measure this stuff? What models fit best?
Exactly. And related to that, John Arquilla from the Naval Postgraduate School criticized the reliance on battle death statistics, arguing that non-combatant deaths in conflicts have actually risen dramatically, which changes the picture if you include them.
A different definition of violence. What about criticisms from historians and anthropologists? They question the narrative itself, right?
Big time. Anthropologist R. Brian Ferguson, for example, challenged Pinker's use of archaeological evidence for prehistoric warfare. He argued it was cherry-picked, and that the broader archaeological record actually shows warfare increasing as societies got bigger and more complex, not decreasing. That directly contradicts Pinker's pacification process.
That's a fundamental challenge to the starting point.
Huge. And others questioned the geographical focus. Elizabeth Colbert in The New Yorker argued Pinker's scope was almost entirely confined to Western Europe and largely ignored colonial violence.
Pinker pushed back on that.
He did, according to the source, pointing to sections he felt did cover global and colonial violence, calling her conclusion postmodernist sophistry. So, sharp disagreements there.
What about other anthropological angles?
Well, Stephen Corey from Survival International criticized it from an indigenous rights perspective. He argued the book promoted a fictitious colonialist image of the brutal savage, a stereotype used historically to justify harming tribal peoples. Rahul Akaka suggested the apparent decline might be partly a scaling issue. Larger states need proportionally fewer soldiers, making the rate drop. Sinisa Milicevic argued Pinker wrongly conflated organized state violence with interpersonal violence, claiming organized violence has actually increased with state power and ideology.
So deep disagreements about how to interpret the historical and anthropological record.
Definitely. And even when new data came out, like a big Nature study on lethal violence rates throughout human history, the interpretation was contested.
How so?
The study found violence rates were high initially, maybe peaked in the Iron Age, then fell. Douglas Fry, an anthropologist, interpreted it as showing Pinker exaggerated Paleolithic violence in social organization was key. Pinker interpreted the same study as confirming a human tendency to violence that was higher in pre-state societies and lower now. So same data, different spin.
Fascinating. What about philosophical or political critiques?
Those were also significant. John Gray, the essayist, saw Pinker's reliance on science for hope as just another kind of faith. Ross Douthat, the columnist, felt Pinker presented a rather simplistic Whiggish view of history, assuming progress began with the Enlightenment and dismissing earlier eras too readily.
And some saw political leanings in the argument.
Yes. Edward Herman and David Peterson wrote a very critical review calling the book Apologetics for Western Imperial Violence. They challenged the long piece by listing numerous U.S. interventions, assassinations, and wars since 1945, arguing Pinker downplayed violence by powerful Western states.
That's a strong charge.
Very. David Bentley Hart, a theologian, was also scathing, accusing Pinker of ecstatic innocence and believing a beautiful falsehood, arguing the decline is just an artifact of population growth, vastly outpacing even increased killing. Craig Lerner questioned the philosophical grounding, suggesting Pinker depicted a piece potentially detached from traditional notions of human dignity or the sacred, leading to a pointed back and forth with Pinker.
Even the definition of violence was debated, wasn't it?
Yes. Ben Laws argued Pinker used a reductive definition focused only on physical violence, ignoring metaphorical violence like economic inequality. Pinker countered that extending the term violence so broadly makes it analytically useless. Physical violence is a distinct phenomenon worth studying on its own.
And David Graeber, the anthropologist, criticized Pinker's debating style.
Yeah, in his book The Dawn of Everything, Graeber accused Pinker of setting up false dilemmas and presupposing a simple linear scale of progress, arguing Pinker's own gradualist approach wasn't necessarily free from justifying violence to prevent a perceived return to darkness. That's right. Historical Reflections in 2018. The editors, Mark McCall and Philip Dwyer, concluded in their introduction that the overall verdict from the contributors was that Pinker's thesis was seriously, if not fatally, flawed. They listed problems like perceived failures in historical methodology, dubious sources, exaggerating the past's violence, and a Western-centric viewpoint.
So alongside the significant praise and influence, there's this substantial body of criticism challenging the book's core claims, methods, and interpretations from almost every angle.
Absolutely. It highlights just how complex and contested this whole area is.
Right.
It wasn't just a quiet academic debate.
No kidding, but despite all that criticism, the book clearly made a huge impact. The source lists quite a few awards and honors.
It did. NYT Notable Book, shortlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize, the Royal Society Winton Prize. Pinker gave the Gifford Lectures based on it, which is a big deal. And yeah, Mark Zuckerberg picked it for his book club, giving it another boost.
And Pinker was out there discussing it widely.
Yeah, the Gifford Lectures are online. He did interviews on places like blottingheads.tv, debated critics. The source also points to related books and concepts in the See Also section, things like War Before Civilization or Hans Rosling's Factfulness, showing this whole discussion about data, violence, and progress is much bigger than just one book.
It's clearly an ongoing conversation.
For sure.
And we've just taken a deep dive into that specific conversation around Pinker's book, using our source material to trace his argument for declining violence.
We've looked at the 6 trends he highlights, the psychological demons and angels he discusses, and those 5 big historical forces he believes reshaped our world.
And crucially, we've also spent time unpacking the really substantial criticisms leveled against the book, challenging the statistics, the historical interpretations, the philosophical underpinnings, the potential biases.
Yeah, this deep dive really showed how one source, the Wikipedia entry, could lay out both a really powerful, widely praised argument and a whole battery of counter-arguments challenging it from multiple expert perspectives.
Okay, so pulling all this together, here's a final thought for you to mull over, based purely on what we've discussed from the source today. Given this intense debate about how we even define violence, how we measure it across centuries, how we interpret patchy historical or archaeological data, how much statistical noise matters, is the picture Pinker paints of a fundamentally more peaceful modern world convincing? Or does the way we frame the question, the data we choose, the narrative lens we adopt, inevitably shape the answer we get? What does this whole deep dive suggest about the sheer difficulty of knowing the truth about something as vast and complex as the history of human violence? And how should you maybe approach evaluating these kinds of grand historical claims when you encounter them?